Welcome to How I Made It Through. I'm Bernadette Thompson, and I'm so glad you are here today as we have a topic that is not always easy to talk about, but it is a part of every family's journey. My guest today is Michael Hallett. Michael is an expert in generational trauma, which can also be known as ancestral trauma. He works and writes in the fields of generational trauma, shame, sexual issues, and the underlying mother wound, the single point of failure at the heart of dysfunctional humanity. Michael worked as a process analyst and software engineer, designer, developer for major industrial and governmental clients in New Zealand, Hong Kong, the United States, and Great Britain before applying his process and analysis skills to human emotional processes. Michael brings a very mechanical approach based on principles and processes to seemingly complex human problems. His new book, The Generational Trauma Workshop Manual, is helping people to begin to understand the trauma that has been passed down and is a guide to begin the healing. I will redo that. But here we'll start. Welcome, Michael. I am so happy that you are here with us today.
Thank you. It's a absolute delight and a pleasure and a privilege to be on the show.
Yeah. I want to share with those that are listening that Michael and I know each other from a professional place. We both have worked with generational and ancestral trauma and understanding how, as we look back into our ancestry, some of that information comes up. But Michael's expertise in truly understanding generational trauma and pulling it apart so that that we all can understand it is just incredible. So, Michael, I'd love for you to just even start with a simple explanation for people that might not understand what we're talking about.
So, all trauma is based on the principle of emotional overwhelm. So that means that somebody, whether it's you or one of your ancestors, encountered a situation that was too emotionally intense for them to deal with it as the person who they were at that time. And that means that the excess overwhelm, the feelings that couldn't be handled, couldn't be contained, they have to go somewhere. And this is quite simply working with the law of conservation of energy. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only be transmitted or transmuted. And in the situation of trauma, the energy gets transmuted into a stuck energy, which we have no way of processing. And saying this may be something that happened to you if you had a traumatic experience during your life, or it could be something that's happened to one of your ancestors. And so it creates this ball of stuck energy that there's no framework for processing. And then we have a situation with epigenetic inheritance, which is where these things can be passed from one generation to another. This has all been quite well documented now. There's a lady called Dr. Rachel Yehuda is probably the point person on the science behind epigenetic inheritance. And so these events can come down over multiple generations and they become watered down, but they also kind of disappear because we just inherit them and we don't know that they're ours. And then they sit in our unconscious, and then something that comes along and it mirrors the original situation that couldn't be addressed, and then boom, the thing flares up in our life and we go, what is this? Where did this come from? Mm-hmm. And as a society, we don't really have an understanding of how this whole process works.
And that is so true, because we live our lives, and the effects of these traumas and things that have been passed down, we've never been taught them. We've never been taught that they affect us, and so we don't have that knowledge of what this is, this emotion that we're having, is connected to something. Could you explain a little bit of what it looks like in a family? Like give an example of how, what a trauma that could happen to somebody in the past, in another generation, and what it would look like in our lives.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to show you my first experience of generational trauma when I had no idea what it even was. I didn't even know the name of it. And this was a situation where I'd started researching my family, started looking into the genealogy, because nobody ever talked about what the family really looked like when I was growing up, because of all of the problems that had happened back in the past. And I realized that the person that I knew the least about was my father's mother, who died in 1926 when he was 4 years old from tuberculosis, as it turned out. I didn't actually know that at the time. I just knew that she had died. And I thought, well, the only thing I can do is I can get a death certificate, and that at least it'll tell me how she died, and it'll tell me who reported it. So I ordered this certificate, and I remember, and it said this will arrive in a week. And I remember thinking, this is going to hurt. And the thought just kind of drifted through and drifted off. And I can remember the letter coming through the letterbox, and I can remember picking the letter up, and I can remember tearing it open. And then there's this blank in my memory. And the next thing, I was lying on the floor, clutching this death certificate, and I was just howling with pain. And there was a part of me that was just kind of looking down and going, this is not my pain. This is my father's pain. And he was 4 years old. It was shortly after the end of World War I. Everybody had lost so much, suffered so much. There was no social allowance for grieving, because it was a sign of weakness, and you couldn't show weakness. And he carried that with him all his life. And then it came down to me. And I say, I had absolutely no idea of what I was dealing with.
Mm. That resonates so much with me, because my father lost his father in 1926 from tuberculosis.
Oh,
So
wow.
it is an incredible connection there. And I watched my father. A year later, he lost his mother from tuberculosis. So he lost both of them. But it is incredible trauma that passed down. So how did when you learned this, what did it teach you about your what did it teach you about you and what you were feeling and understand? Did it help you understand?
It helped enormously. Because when I was growing up, I would say on both sides of my family, there were double instances of abandonment for both of my parents. So both of them had quite difficult childhoods. And the result was that when I was growing up, it was almost like the previous generation of grandparents just didn't exist. There was almost nothing by way of stories. There were photographs, but these were hidden away in the bottom of a cupboard. There was memorabilia, and that was buried away. And so I actually grew up in this place where there was essentially a vacuum around the family narrative. And you start, as a child, you don't know that. All you do is you start to piece together the pieces from the little scraps of information that you have. And because some of them are misleading, because families in particular will hide the events that they're ashamed of, like divorces. Mm-hmm. And so you end up growing up and creating a false reality based on partial or missing narrative of the family. Mm-hmm. And so I found that I was starting to piece together a story that I'd never known. And so, for instance, I had this belief that my mother came from Cornwall, based on the fact that we went there once in the 1960s, and that was something to do with her mother. In fact, she had nothing to do with Cornwall. When I finally looked into it, she was born literally 15 miles from where I'm speaking to you today. And it was almost like being right around the world and landed, say, almost where, say 15 miles from where my mother was born. And it's like, so there was a whole other story that had never been told.
Mm. It is, there's so much that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to go back to just the interesting thing about, my dad losing his parents, and it totally, and the part that I really resonated that you were talking about is everything was put away. It had such an impact on his life, yet it was barely talked about. I
Yeah,
knew that
absolutely.
I knew that his parents had died because my great aunts and uncles, two sets, raised him and his brother. Um, but that was the narrative was, oh, Nan and Bob and Peg and Tom took care of him. So that was period. There was no talk of trauma and how difficult that this was. And I would imagine that would have been the same as well for your dad.
Yes, but I'm sure that they didn't have a language for it.
Right.
There's no talk of it because there's no language for it.
Mm-hmm.
There was no framework. One of the things that I found was as I started working through the layers, I actually had to construct a language
Mm-hmm.
within myself and a capacity to speak it, because this trauma impacted me from conception.
Mm-hmm.
So it's happened before I've actually gained the ability to speak. It's a pre-verbal trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I then gain the ability to speak later doesn't mean that I can speak into this darkness that's right there at the core of all our beings.
Right.
And,
Well,
and
and then, and this was one trauma. I mean, even though there's layers and layers to this one trauma, you and I both know as we begin to look back into our ancestry and to look at other family, other parts of the tree, other limbs and leaves, that we discover that this trauma comes down from many, many different sides of the family. Could you share a little bit? I know you have some stories related to your grandmother that might be good to share with our audience.
yeah, so on my grandmother's side, there's there's a
I
whole
know there's so much.
raft of stuff there.
Yeah.
But what happened on that, the key thing that happened there was, say, my grandfather was a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps in World War One. So he was one of the very first pilots in Britain, and he flew through World War One. He was decorated for bravery. Came back from the war, married the pretty young thing from South London when there were not so many men around, and all of that success story. But the reality of the relationship is that it failed, and they were living on Royal Air Force bases in the 1920s when there was no money, there was no hot water on them, there was no electricity. These were difficult places. She'd come from the South London pub scene full of light and life, and the marriage failed somewhere along the way, and she ended up having an affair. And normally in the 1930s, when a marriage broke up, the children would go with the mother. And in this case, my father went to court and won custody of my mother because he was the upstanding, wing commander in the Royal Air Force and all of this. And so it looks like a great victory for social justice, but actually it destroyed my mother. Mm-hmm. Because she'd been abandoned by her own mother, who preferred having an affair to looking after her. And just the blow to her self-esteem, she never recovered from that.
Yeah.
And she absolutely doted on her father. She thought but she never actually spoke of him. But I know that she was absolutely, clung to him because he appeared to be the person who saved her and looked after her. But actually, emotionally, she was wrecked.
That is so. It's so interesting because it really, as a young child, you don't understand, what's going on. You don't know what to do with those emotions. And, things, again, we talk about it like things are never talked about. and it becomes, even if it's not a secret, even if what is, the knowledge that your grandmother was essentially kicked out and, had to leave the family, even with that knowledge, it's still not, talked about, because it's like, oh, look who she was raised by, this, wonderful father who loved her. And so that is so, it's just so.
And so I had to go through a whole process of resolving that side of the family, because that was, from an energetic perspective, that was just this limb that was just completely fractured off the side of the family. And so my grandmother had retired to Cornwall, which is where the whole Cornwall thing came in from. And but nobody knew anything about it. And eventually one day I got an email out of the blue from a relative on my grandmother's side saying, I found the address of the house where she retired. And one of the things I found is that once you start looking for information starts looking for you. Bernadette's
we both know that.
Yeah. So I remember I got this address and I thought, okay, I'm being summoned here. And I Googled it and I found nothing. And I thought, oh, okay, false trail. And then about 3 months later, the phone rang at home one night and my wife answered it. And some friends of ours were going to Cornwall for a long weekend, and they rented a place, and there was a spare room. And they said, do you want to come to Cornwall for the weekend? Now, we did know the town where she lived. It was a little town called Rock. And I can remember my wife saying, do you want to go to Cornwall for the weekend? And my brain was going, whereabouts in Cornwall? And I got halfway through thinking the thought before I knew. Oh, okay. And sure enough, they'd booked this place in Rock. So I said, yeah, okay, all right, let's go. But I still didn't know the where this house was. And the night before we went, I went back to this email and I noticed that there were several spelling mistakes, and this relative of mine wasn't a very good speller, and the house name was quite unusual. And I had just had a couple of guesses at what this name might be, and straight away I found a council document. So so say you knock and the door shall open.
Well, Michael, this is where the spiritual sides of us and the just doing this work, come together, because our ancestors are with us and they want these stories to unfold, because they want us to heal. And so when we energetically get those hits on where we're supposed to look or what we're supposed to, when something pops up, it's not by accident. And
so I don't directly connect with the ancestors in the way that you do, but I do get those nudges, and occasionally there's something. And this is actually one of the times, because so we went out to Cornwall and we drove up to this house, and I was sitting parked outside the car and I almost couldn't push the door open. I could just feel this wall of pain. And it was almost like I just need to take one step, and I just pushed the door open and I got out of the car, and I just literally, it was my grandmother's pain. Yeah. And she'd never wanted to break up the family. She'd never wanted to lose contact with her daughter. She was just a human being caught in a human situation, a situation of overwhelm for her. But I remember feeling very specifically, it was almost like this angel picked me up and literally walked me to the house. And I've had that experience 3 times in difficult situations. And I say I'm not prone to those sorts of experiences. So those are quite unusual for me, but that was one of the times. And it was literally somebody saying, you take one step and we will take the rest for you. Yeah. And I remember just all of this pain coming through. And then I just had the realization, that there is no moral high ground. This woman, my grandmother, has been maligned as the black sheep and the wrongdoer for the best part of a century. And she
was a woman in pain. And talking about the spirit side of it, you were walked to it. We have this connection, and when these things start to open, we realize that there's a story that they're trying to share with us. And it is this, and the more we talk about it, ancestral healing, generational trauma, the more we talk about it, the more we realize how every family has this in their story. That I don't think there's anybody who, I don't think trauma skips a family.
No, it's just a question of degree.
Right. Yeah. A question of degree. And even in those, we were talking a little bit before I got on, or we got on, and I was talking about the trauma in my life as a young child. And if you were to look back at, I was one of 8 children. I was the 6th of 8 children. My parents were lovely people. They loved me. You would never say that I was somebody that was in a trauma situation. But the chaos and the trauma of raising a family, and my father with his trauma, my mother with her trauma, all of those experiences go into, I was a highly sensitive person in the sense that I absorbed all of that. And I realized the trauma responses, which is one of the things that I'm trained in. I understand what trauma responses are. But that's where it's adulthood. It is just recently that I began to realize how much that trauma has affected my life and how I walk through the world. How about for you? How has it affected you?
Yeah, hugely affected. So my father carried a lot of anger and resentment from his childhood hurts, and it was like this dark cloud that hung over the family at all times. There was this anger, but it was latent. It didn't come out very often. I can't stay here and say that I was beaten frequently or anything like that. It wasn't like that. And in some things like that, I think he was actually ahead of the curve, considerably ahead of many other families.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, there was this constant being on guard. And like Bernadette, I'm quite sensitive, and so it's just like the sense that you're constantly on the watch. And it was almost like a feeling like the family was just splattered against the walls like this because of this energy in the middle that nobody could approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And what was interesting is that as I grew older, and it took me a long time to see this, but the same thing happened between my brother and I. We used to play a lot as children, and then as adults, we just grew further and further apart, as if this energy was pushing us apart long after its source, like this explosion that just kept going and going. And one of the things that happened through the trauma clearing is that I reconnected with my brother. He used to be just like a message on somebody's birthday or Christmas, and that was it.
Yeah.
And now we're much more deeply connected because of being able to go, oh, look at this. But I can see in his family, I can see that some of his children, the same pattern is continuing. Yes. Of this energetic splattering.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up the patterns of behavior, because along with trauma, the way people learn to cope with trauma develops patterns of the way they respond to things, or specific patterns, and that is something that is easier sometimes for people to recognize. They don't necessarily recognize what has caused some of the patterns in their family. And I'm talking about things that keeping secrets. We don't talk outside the family. You don't share this with anybody, those types of things, or even fears. Somebody has had lost a child. Somebody in the past lost a child in a drowning, and then it is the fear of children in water that is over exemplified, and so it's one of the things that might help our people listening to connect, to understand that they can start to recognize that there might have been trauma in their family just by patterns of behavior that have been passed down.
Yeah, so anytime you see what looks like an excessive response to a situation, you might be dealing with a trauma situation. So, for instance, we see quite often instances of overprotective mothering, for instance.
Mhm.
And so you might have been somebody who was a child who felt exposed in the family, and when they have children, they flip 180 degrees and they overprotect the child.
Right. Hmm. And it can be in uh, just ways like, well, what was passed down. I mean, so many things passed down in my family, but one of the things that was passed down is basically, you're fine. Don't worry about it. Don't, any kind of emotion that would come up. It was just like, we don't let those emotions become bigger. You're fine. There's nothing.
Yeah,
There's nothing wrong with you. Move on.
yeah. There's almost like there's a catalogue of ones that almost, those ones and the don't. This doesn't, what stays in the what's said in the family stays in the family. Those are like ones everybody's got, and
Right.
then people have got a bunch of individual ones depending on individual situations. Another one is excessive grief, and somebody
Yes.
where somebody dies and there's somebody who is just inconsolably distraught, almost to the point where being unable to walk or unable to function.
Yes.
And they may be actually feeling grief from something that's happened 1, 2, 3, 4 generations previously that nobody's even given a thought to.
Right. And I want to move on to the book, but just wanted to talk a little bit about that. The story in my family, which I think is so, it's my great aunts raised, and their husbands raised my father and his brother. But when his parents died, they put all of the things, anything to do with them, up in the attic. So there were pictures, and you talked about this a little earlier, pictures, memorabilia, anything that had to do with them was put up in the attic. And so I never saw pictures of my grandparents. I just knew that they had died. It wasn't, and when both of my great aunts passed away, and they happened to pass close to each other, my Uncle Bob went up in the attic and brought down all of these pictures and everything, and showed them to my father, and it sent him reeling in having to go through this grief all over again. He was the older of the two. So he was 6 years old when his mother died. And so he had some buried memories there, and to suddenly see pictures, there was never a picture around. He may have seen one or two of them back when he was little, but so it was that grief that revisits when these things come up years and years later, whether it is pictures that bring it up, or whether it is you've just learned some knowledge about something, and it hits you like a ton of bricks.
So the other thing is that some really good things can get buried along in an
Correct.
attempt to bury the pain and the shame, is that the positive things get buried as well because they're linked through the same person. So, for instance, my grandfather, as I said, was one of the very first pilots in Great Britain, and he actually had an amazing career. He flew the first scheduled airline flight in Britain, and he built
Wow.
his own aircraft. He won an air race. All of this was going on. And then he flew in the war, and he was twice decorated for bravery. And I knew he was a pilot, but I didn't really know any details. And as I started digging into it, it's like, oh my God, this is really important stuff. And it was all, it was just all completely just gone
Very.
because the reminder of it was too painful for my mother.
Yeah. And that's what they did back then. Part of what anything that was loss, or something that was not not wanting to be remembered, was just pushed back, and you didn't go anywhere near it, you stayed just right in until the emotions start coming up. And I want to talk about your book, which it has just come out. It came out in March, and it is the Generational Trauma Workshop Manual.
Here we are.
Yes.
You can see that.
Mm-hmm. Can you begin to share a little bit of so your journey through your own discoveries yourself brought you to becoming an expert and really going deep into the generational trauma and helping people understand it? Could you share a little bit of that journey and share about how people can use this book?
Yeah. So this is the how I made it through podcast. So how I made it through is actually thanks to tomato paste.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to work for H.J. Heinz in New Zealand, or their predecessor in New Zealand, and we were designing sort of the first generation of software that was trying to track how you made things from raw materials. And it's a specific way of thinking, and because you're dealing with raw materials that have got different chemical properties, it's very fluid, and it's actually turned out to be a very good model for mapping human emotional responses. And my gift is pattern recognition. I see a few pieces and I go, oh, that's a pattern, that's a process. And so basically what this book is putting together the pieces of how trauma works, because it works in a very mechanical way. Once you actually understand it, trauma forms under mechanical conditions and it releases under mechanical conditions when you understand them and work with them rather than against them, which is what most people end up doing. And so my journey was, I was just found myself digging through these layers. One of the other attributes of trauma is that the closer you get to the source of the trauma, the more it affects you. So you end up in this kind of race against time, against this beast that's pulling you under. And so I ended up sort of having to deconstruct all of the stuff that was happening inside me and just figuring it out. And I just started to look at it in terms of laws and processes and principles, which is a completely different model from where most people in the trauma field are coming from. But I think for people, particularly for people with a strong analytical approach, it's an approach that really resonates. So it provides very simple descriptions of how trauma works. This is not an academic treatise that the first sentence is 27 lines long and you're just going, oh,
no, it is you, as soon as you begin to read it, you are just you're sucked in, because you start immediately seeing your own things in your own family. Could you share a little bit about what's some trauma responses? Like, people don't necessarily know what trauma looks like in their lives, or a trauma response. Could you share just a little bit of what a trauma response might look like?
So a trauma response is when an event happens that mirrors a part of us that we haven't processed. So there's the ball of energy. So for instance, if we had abandonment, so if we've had an abandonment issue, say both of my parents were abandoned multiple times. So I grew up with both my parents were genealogically what's called fused. So that they were absolutely locked together. They were not going apart. They were not going anywhere. But there was no emotional pliability. And so I grew up feeling abandoned as a child, even though my parents were there, and which I presumed was something to do with me and my fault and not them, because they were obviously there and trying to do their best. So that was really puzzling. But later on, when I hit into experiences of abandonment myself, and I lost a very dear, very, very close connection, and it actually triggered my parents' abandonment. So I
Mhm.
found myself having these massive feelings of abandonment. So it's any time that you're seeing a response that doesn't correlate to
Yes.
what's driving the response. When
Yes.
it's a disproportionate response, any
Correct.
time could be anywhere. So, for
Yes.
instance, one of the things that happened for years, I struggled with tax and tax returns. I always had a lot of fear around it. It
Mhm.
always felt very onerous, very scary, and I used to struggle with it, which is a disproportionate response because actually, filling in your tax returns actually pretty straightforward. And in about 3 years ago, I got an email. Again, this is the same lady who sent me the address of my grandmother's house, and she'd unearthed this article from a newly digitized photo archive showing that my great grandfather had been convicted of tax fraud in
Wow.
1921.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I was looking at the date, and the date was bothering me. It was like this was even before my mother was born. Why is this
Yeah.
an issue? And then I realized the date of the trial was exactly 9 months before my mother was born.
Wow.
She was conceived in the middle of a family crisis meltdown.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, it
And
is.
after I actually discovered that this was going on, I was able to process those feelings. They took about 2 years to fully
Mhm.
surface.
Yeah.
And then after that, yeah, not an issue. Quite very, very happy to sort all that out.
Yeah.
It's just
Wow.
extraordinary.
Well, and it is extraordinary. I mean, that's just, an amazing. And you and I both know that mainstream or psychologists started um, to look at the descendants of the Holocaust and look at the trauma of the Holocaust. And I know that you've done some research in that area, you have some knowledge. Could you share a little bit about
Yeah,
how?
this is kind of where the whole thing started, where they started to understand that there is something going on here. I mean,
Yeah.
the Bible's been banging on about this for 3,000 years, and everyone's going, oh, whatever. And so it started with research into the children of Holocaust victims in
Mhm,
America, New York. And
mhm.
what they found that some of these children of Holocaust victims could smell burning flesh.
Mm.
And it's like, how do you explain it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the temptation is to say, no, you're making that up. And
Right.
then say people like Dr. Rachel Yehuda started going in and saying, oh, let's actually have a look at this, shall we?
Yeah. And that is really where this all became a little bit more mainstream,
Yeah.
because
Mm.
the descendants of Holocaust victims, uh,
Yeah.
their responses have just been over exaggerated. I try
Yeah,
and use that.
one of them, I remember this quote. It said, I live on the Upper West Side, but I'm wired for Auschwitz.
Yeah. Yes, I read that, and it's
It's like, yeah,
so, and it's really true, and that opened the door for people to realize that so many of us, as our ancestors have come across, you are in the UK, so you didn't come across the pond, but we went through the same wars, we went through, have gone through
mm,
a lot of the same famine and things that break families apart. So we all are a part of this, and you don't have to look back. I mean, if we go back way back into history, I mean, if you go back 10 generations, you're going to find trauma. But even when you go back a generation or two, there's tremendous trauma that have just all been taught not to talk about. That this is your life, and we deal with it and then wonder why we're reacting the way that we are reacting, and the emotions are the way. So how can somebody use the book? Like what's a good way for them to start, just go through and read it? Is there a way that you have intended for it to be used?
basically, it's to demystify
Hmm.
inherited trauma. As I say, it works along a very small set of very rigid principles. However, it plays out uniquely in every one of our lives. And so when you look at it, you think, oh, how can I, this is too confusing, this is too foggy and vague.
Mhm.
But actually, once you understand the principles, and this is what I do in my session work, is you tell me what your symptoms are, and I'm going to identify the principle and the process that you're being governed by here, and that will tell us how we need to respond to it. And this is trying to get that knowledge out into you so that you can do that in your own life. And say it's very, very simple processes, very simple laws, and then there is a bunch of tools in there. And so there's tools to start looking at your family tree, start looking at the clues. You're looking for the disturbances in the family tree. Again, say everywhere there's a disturbance, there will be shame, and where there is shame, there will be something buried.
Mhm.
So when you're looking back up the family tree, what you're seeing is not necessarily what actually happened.
Mhm.
And by understanding how the past leaves disturbances in the trail of the family record, you can start. It's almost like detectives. Detectives talk about a copper's nose, or a detective having a sense that something's not right here, and it's
Yeah.
almost equipping you with that sense to just look at things in your family and go, that's not right. That must have been traumatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah,
that,
I remember a guy having a session with a guy, and he told me that it was his great grandfather or somewhere back there had changed his surname from his surname to his mother's surname.
mm,
And he was telling me that he'd been through his genealogy line and understood it all. And I said, well, why did that happen? And he said, oh, I don't know.
yeah.
Like, this is a massive red flag for shame.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the word shame. And I do want our listeners to know that both Michael and I and another colleague of ours, Rochelle Khanna, are putting together a series of understanding trauma and shame, and how you can begin to look back into your history and see these things. And it's one of the things that I do working with clients, is being able to look at genealogy with a trauma informed lens. And so looking back and being uh, looking for clues that would say what went wrong in this family. And amazingly, there is a lot that is there that we can find. Like Michael, you have found, and sometimes it comes through a little bit of a phone call from somebody who out of the blue gives you information that you didn't expect to get. How can people work with you? Like, how do they, if somebody wants to work personally with you?
Well, I have a number of offerings. Say that there's a whole raft of free blogs on my website. So if you want to just wade into that, they were written pretty much as I was going through them, almost like a diary thing. So it's quite a shorthand, and they're not organized, so it's just a big mess in there. Then I've got some online courses. Some of them are free, some of them are paid. I've got the book there, which is available on Amazon.
Mhm.
And I also do one-to-one sessions where we can, say, go right into the heart of the matter. And if you're dealing with a trauma that's really blowing up and really pressing, I would honestly recommend going in for some face-to-face work, because that is the fastest way to move forward. And I'd say I'd be delighted to hear from you.
It is, and you and I both know this, that what happens when you recognize that you need some help in this area, and you begin to learn about these traumas, that it brings a tremendous amount. It begins the healing process immediately, and it brings this feelings of compassion and forgiveness for yourself, and the reactions that you have shown as a trauma, this has been passed down to you, but also for the perpetrators, even if there is shame and somebody has done something very that you don't want to share, you don't want to look at. That healing comes in as we begin to allow ourselves to really look at it. Do you want to say something a little about that?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say actually is that that website name is actually not quite correct. It's got 2 T's on the end.
Oh, I will correct that right now.
Yeah. So we can get that sorted. Here we go.
Yes, get it sorted right away.
Get tech onto it.
Mm-hmm. But go ahead and share.
Yes. So just regrouping. So the question around releasing the sense of injustice, and what happens as we process trauma, whether it's ours or it's something that's been inherited, is that we actually go in and we feel those overwhelmed feelings. So we release the backlog of feelings. Mm-hmm. And as you release the backlog of feelings, not only does your own sense of internal pressure reduce, and the behavior that comes in response to those feelings just falls away naturally. You don't have to reparent it. Just processing those feelings clears all that up. But also you start to see the humanity of the people who were involved, and particularly the people who did wrong, because generally they were just responding to their own situation, and very often they're responding to their own trauma, because trauma replicates.
Yeah.
So somebody was beaten as a child, and what do? They grow up as a child beater, because that was what was programmed into them.
Yeah.
And it's, as I say, it's quite mechanical. And people make a thing about forgiving our ancestors, but actually the most important, you can't forgive without the processing, because if not, you're bypassing. The feelings are still there, and you're just going to say, oh no, well, I'm going to say I love my ancestors. You're bypassing the situation.
Yeah.
You need to go in and you need to process. And once you've processed, the forgiveness comes automatically, because what was causing the pain goes. Once you clear the pain, only then can you truly see the situation and the humanity of the participants.
Yeah, sorry I cut you off there, because it's just so, what you're just saying right now is just so important. And a lot of people will talk about ancestral healing as an energetic, which I know that there is definitely some there can be some energetic releasing but understanding, going into the generational trauma, going into the deeper understanding is so important, even if it feels scary, even if it feels uncomfortable. That it's an amazing, you discover more about who you are, and that's really one of the most important. So time always goes so fast, but is there something that you would like to just share to end and to encourage people to in this topic?
I would say that if there's something bothering you, take it on, deal with that. Really, you will be surprised at the things that might seem completely irretrievable when you actually process the overwhelmed feelings behind them. The change that's possible is quite extraordinary, and the journey, and I know Bernadette would agree with this, the journey is quite extraordinary, because it is literally quite a magical journey. And it does feel like the forces of the universe are conspiring to help you and resolve this. And it deepens you as a person. It just brings you into a much greater awareness. And instead of repeating the patterns of the past, you're then able to hold space for actually resolving them. And I think particularly with the younger generations who are so anxious, I think the older generations really need to do their work as much as possible to create safe
Yes.
containers for the younger ones who are going to be hitting into this to a much greater extent than we did.
Yeah.
So I would say don't sit on the fence. Start now. Even if you just start looking at your family tree, go and read some free blogs on my site.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
don't, say.
I agree. I agree. And, this is, and I want to, how I made it through, we share a lot about our spiritual side and understanding just our deep connections. And I just want, Michael has said it eloquently. It is so important. Our ancestors are wanting us to go through this process. And so don't leave it. There is, even in the smallest amount of inquiry that you do into your into your family's life, there will be things that will come up that will help you. So Michael, I can't thank you enough for being here, and I look forward to the work that we will continue together, and I would love to have you come back on again.
No, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I just want to just encourage you, all of them. This is something that all of us really need to start being responsible for. And I just really encourage you to get started. And thanks again, Bernadette, for having me on the podcast.
Thanks so much. Well, till next time.